You would absolutely know a lich gate if you saw one. They make popular backdrops for wedding photos and provide a quaint air of rustic charm to country churchyards. They're the wooden or stone gateway, often complete with a tiled roof, that marks the entry into the churchyard. Not all churches have them, and they are far more common outside churches in the countryside than in suburban or city centre churches. You do also find them in other countries outside of Britain as well, which is quite cool. And they do have some folklore attached to them. So in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore, let's take a look at what lich gates were for and what beliefs they gave rise to. We'll also have a look at some popular burial markers that you might see in churchyards or cemeteries so that we can broaden our focus to the wider burials. Let's get started. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. It is April already. Where have the first 3 months of the year gone? This is absolutely silly, but never mind. As you might have gathered, I'm having a little bit of bother with my voice again, so hopefully it will last long enough to do this recording. And as I am recording, it is Wednesday afternoon and the sky is a glorious shade of cornflower blue and one of the birds is really enjoying the bird bath in the front garden, so it really does feel like spring has sprung. Which makes it a really odd day to be talking about lich gates, but never mind. Somebody did request them, and as you know, I am a sucker for all things related to death, mourning, burials, all that kind of stuff. And churches in particular, I think, do have a lot of folklore attached to them. That is why Mark Norman has just written a book about the folklore of churches, which I will obviously mention nearer the time it actually comes out, because I can't remember when it is due to be released, but there we go. And I think because there are so many things that you can cover, I thought we'll just swing back round and do some more church-related stuff off the back of church names last week. So because of the fact someone wanted lich gates, that's why we're looking at them. And you might be going, what is a lich gate? Now, usually it's spelt the way that I've got it in the title of this episode as all one word. Sometimes it's also spelt as two separate words, so lich gate. And it comes from lich, meaning body or corpse. And I've seen some people call that a medieval word. Some people have said it's an Old English word. Other people have said it's a Saxon word. But basically that's where lich comes from in this particular instance. Now, in some places, lich gates are also known as resurrection gates. And as a concept, they date to roughly the 7th century. And they mark the boundary between consecrated and unconsecrated ground. Now that might be why one legend from Wooler in Northumberland recollected that a suicide had been buried at the churchyard gate, which is another name for them. Suicides were one of the groups of people that were denied a burial in consecrated ground, so burying someone at the gate was basically as close as they were going to get to that consecrated ground. So the oldest lich gate, which is still standing, is said to be from the 13th century at St George's Churchyard in Beckenham, South London. Obviously, it's difficult to ascertain if that one is the oldest, but the inscription that has been added to it is basically where people have gotten that idea from. The first lich gates were made of wood, which is obviously why a lot of the earliest ones no longer exist, although brick eventually replaced the wood, while clay tiles replaced the wooden roofs, and obviously that made them a little bit more durable. Their construction material largely depended on what was available in the local area, as you might imagine, so Welsh lich gates would use Welsh stone, while timber was far more common in Kent, Middlesex and Hertfordshire. So what were lich gates actually for? Well, despite the name, they weren't actually just gates. They're actually small enclosures designed as a waiting area before a burial, and they needed to be big enough to hold a few people and a bier, which is the thing used to carry the deceased to the churchyard. So in some places, the corpse bearers would bring the body wrapped in its burial shroud to the lich gate, where it was then laid on the parish bier, and they might have followed a corpse road from some distant settlement in order to reach the nearest churchyard with burial rites. The bearers would then use the parish bier until the burial took place, and then the bier would return to its place in the church, or indeed sometimes the churchyard, until it was needed again. Elsewhere, corpse bearers would take the parish bier to the home of the deceased to collect the body, and then they would bring them back to the lich gate on the bier. The body would then stay on the bier until the funeral, although sometimes, depending on the time of day that was, it didn't actually happen until the following day. So the lich gate thus provided shelter for the bearers who would guard the body overnight, because obviously at that point, where else are you going to put the body? You don't really want to leave it in the church. You can't just leave it lying out in the churchyard, so the lich gate then provides this waiting area. And this is obviously before mortuaries existed, so it provides that halfway house, as it were. Then on the day of the burial, the vicar came out to meet the body at the lich gate, and the written instructions for that part of the ritual date to 1549, although an instruction in the Common Prayer Book from 1662 specified that the burial service should begin at the lich gate before the vicar led the corpse bearers into the church. So the lich gate becomes the point at which the burial service really starts. The practice of leaving the corpse in the lich gate died out during the 18th century, partly because of the growth of things like mortuaries, although they're more of a 19th century thing. But lich gates were either left to rot or were just simply dismantled and reused elsewhere. That's why there are remarkably few of them left. That being said, during the 19th century, churches often repaired or rebuilt their lich gates purely to provide memorials for wealthy locals. So rather than people just leaving money for like a plaque in the church, they would actually now leave money for the lich gate to be restored and that to be a memorial to them. After the First World War, lich gates then got a new purpose and they also became war memorials as well. Now, lich gates followed a variety of stylistic designs, but they're all sort of the same principle, if that makes sense. So they all have seats or benches, there's a lich stone for the corpse or bier, often a lich cross, and they're all covered as well. Now, obviously, if it was raining, you would have to hope that the wind wasn't blowing it in from either direction, but ultimately, at least you had some kind of shelter. The seats obviously gave the corpse bearer somewhere to sit, while the lich stone gave them somewhere to put the corpse so it didn't touch the ground. And I did once read that the corpse or coffin couldn't touch the ground, because if it did, the spirit might just wander off. So using the lich stone meant that it had to stay with the coffin. And I cannot find where I got that from originally, which is really annoying and really unlike me. So if anyone knows, if you just let me know if you've heard that one as well. But that is apparently why they couldn't put the corpse down. I can't help thinking it's probably slightly more of a practical reason, that it would be easier to lift the coffin if it was sitting on like a narrow bench, or the corpse if it was lying on a narrow bench, rather than having it sitting on the ground, which would be cold, probably wet, maybe dirty if that was an issue, I guess. But it would definitely be easier to pick something up if it was balanced on a ledge or something, rather than trying to pick it up from the ground. So I do sort of feel like there's probably a practical reason for that one. But as I say, I did find that piece of folklore, and it really irritates me that I can't find where I got that from originally. But there we go. I thought I'd include it anyway, though, just in case anyone has heard that one. Other lich gates also occasionally changed the layout, although not necessarily by much. But there's two examples from Wales where a lich gate in Derwent in Denbighshire had an upper room above the lich gate which they used for storage, which makes a lot of sense. And meanwhile, a lich gate in Whitford in Flintshire had an upstairs space that was actually used as a schoolroom. So that's an interesting use for the building as a whole. And then as the practice of using lich gates fell out of use, so the locals then enclosed the downstairs part of the lich gate and then just turned that into an extra classroom as well. Some lich gates actually had inscriptions, often which would proclaim the glory of God, or otherwise refer to the lich gate's role as a transitionary space. And there was a new lich gate installed at an unnamed gate church. I'm not sure where, I'm going to guess Montreal, because this was reported by the Montreal Star, and it had the words, "This is the gate of heaven," over the top of the lich gate. But when the paint was wet, somebody added a printed notice reading, "Please go around the other way." And I thought that was quite funny, the idea that you've got to go the other way around the gate of heaven. That tickled me. It might not tickle you in the same way, but I thought I'd include it just because it was quite amusing. Clearly, with something so fundamentally connected with death, it is unsurprising that lich gates accrued a handful of omens and superstitions, and there was a Welsh belief from Llandysul that if the vicar heard the lich gate click as if someone opened it, but then no one was actually there, it meant he would be sent for to administer to a dying man. And I think that's quite common of the sort of omens that you get where the sound of something heralds what that would normally mean, if that makes sense. And there's a similar superstition from 1946 in Sussex, which suggested that if the church door rattled at night for no apparent reason, it would soon open to let a corpse through. That one didn't specify if it meant the door to the church or the lich gate, but I thought I would include it because of the fact it was quite similar. Thankfully, however, the Lichgate could also be a positive part of local celebrations. So Reverend R.M. Heenley described a celebration at Upton Gray in Hampshire on May 29th, or Royal Oak Day, and here bell ringers rang the bells at 6 a.m, and then they would put large oak branches over the church porch and Lichgate, and then they would put smaller oak branches on everyone's gate. And they did that to ensure good luck for the rest of the year. Forgetting to do so would herald some kind of disaster. So I thought that was quite nice that at least the Lichgate got included in, true, something to ward off evil and bad things, but generally otherwise quite a positive celebration. Now, unfortunately, that is about as much folklore as I was actually able to find about Lichgate, and I can't help thinking that the way that they fell out of use may have been part of the reason as to why a lot of the folklore has either fallen away or been forgotten and just not passed on. Now they're more often, like I said at the beginning, photographic backdrops, they're memorials, or they can just simply be a scenic part of the churchyard. So I thought it might be quite useful at this point to turn our attention to other things that you might find in a churchyard or cemetery. Now obviously please do remember that a churchyard or graveyard is so called because it's attached to a church, hence the name, whereas cemeteries don't need that connection, so you don't have to have a church attached to a cemetery. They've usually got their own chapel instead. And there's such a massive difference between cemetery gates, I think, and lich gates as well, because obviously by the time you got cemeteries, you didn't really have the same issue of having to wait for burial, but then if you did, that was where there was usually a chapel of rest or something like that. At the entrance to Jesmond Old Cemetery, if I remember correctly, inside the entrance that's now on the Cradlewell bypass, that side does actually have, they call them catacombs, but they're not really. They've just basically got like subterranean storage spaces, like loculi, like you would get in a catacomb. They've got that as storage for bodies before burial, but obviously they don't really need to use them now, because by the time people turn up for burial, you don't really have the same issue of having to leave them overnight and things like that. That's a complete side issue. I just thought I would throw that in while it seemed relevant. But the first type of grave marker that you're probably likely to see most often is angels. And you can obviously understand why angels are found in churchyards. There's one in a cemetery in Bolden, which is just near Sunderland. And the owner actually had a supply of spare fingers because people were forever snapping one of her fingers off for some bizarre reason. And then he would just cement them back on again, which I always thought was quite unfair on the angel, but there we go. But perhaps the most famous of the angel markers is the Angel of Grief. And she's based on a sculpture found on the grave of Emmeline Story at the Protestant Cemetery in Rome from 1894. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to put images of each of these on the screen. If you're not, then I would recommend go to the blog post and I've put images in there instead, and the link is in the show notes for that. Now, with this particular Angel of Grief marker, Emmeline's husband, William Wetmore Story, was a sculptor, and this was his last major work before he died the year after she did. Its full title is The Angel of Grief Weeping Over the Dismantled Altar of Life, and this is a memorial of the angel sort of bent forwards, sort of with her hands thrown forward as if in despair with her face down. That's the Angel of Grief. While Story lost interest in sculpture after the loss of his wife, his children recommended that he make this sculpture as a memorial to her. And it's gone on to inspire copies throughout the world, and the one that I've got on screen right now is actually from All Saints Cemetery in Newcastle. If the angels on a burial marker have their wings open, it kind of represents the soul on its way to heaven. And angels with a trumpet represent Gabriel and usually indicate some kind of connection with Judgment Day, while angels with swords are usually the Archangel Michael. So that's quite cool as well. Crosses are, for obvious reasons, quite heavily associated with graveyards, but then you do also come across Celtic crosses quite a lot of the time. So they're the cross which then has the loop around the top end, and they're usually quite heavily decorated as well. They were a really, really popular choice for headstones in the Victorian era. But the design itself actually appeared across Britain, Ireland and France in the early Middle Ages. Nobody's entirely sure where it came from, although some people think it might have been a form of indigenous Bronze Age art. Other people think it was actually a Coptic cross inspired by the Egyptian Ankh. But the Celtic cross really gained popularity during the Celtic revival in the 19th century, so that's why you see so many of them in Victorian cemeteries in particular. You probably have seen urns on monuments, and they nearly always have what looks like a draped cloth over them, and the cloth can indicate the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. Other people think it actually references the black cloth or pall that was once draped across the coffin on the way to the cemetery. And that's where pallbearer is really the wrong term, because that would be somebody holding the cloth and not the coffin. But again, that's a complete side issue. The urn itself in this particular monument represents the ashes to ashes, dust to dust part of death. Some believe that the cloth draped across the urn actually guards the ashes, while others think that the cloth is pushed back from the urn to allow the soul to ascend to heaven. You'll hear various different versions, and I've come across lots of different people saying different versions, and that's why it's worthwhile just including all of them, really. We also have 3 very, very, very common types of burial markers that, again, you often find from the Victorian era, and that's obelisks, steps, and the broken column. So monuments that have 3 steps at the bottom are quite common. Some people think that they represent faith, hope and charity. Other people think that they represent the Holy Trinity. Either way, they also serve quite a good structural purpose, because obviously the largest step is always the bottom. So it just kind of anchors everything together quite nicely from a building point of view. And then the obelisk is incredibly popular in Victorian cemeteries because of the massive wave of Egyptomania in the Victorian era. However, it can also apparently represent sunshine or the link between heaven and earth as well. But I think it's probably more likely the new interest in Egyptian culture at the time, which also explains why you find pyramids in quite a lot of Victorian cemeteries as grave markers as well. Meanwhile, the broken column was believed to demonstrate a life cut short. The final one is the Death and the Maiden, which you occasionally find, and the one that I found, that is the image that's in the video at the moment, or indeed in the blog post, is actually from a cemetery in Aveiro, Portugal, and this represents the Death and the Maiden visual trope. This first appeared in Germany in the early 1500s, and the image was intended to create a juxtaposition between life and death, and in many of them the woman doesn't look particularly pleased to have become the object of death's affections. However, in this particular version, the relationship seems like a much more welcome one. Death's presence doesn't seem to be a source of worry or concern, and the downturned torch in the maiden's hand represents a life extinguished, so she's now ready to go with him. We do see a similar expression of the trope in the work of both Evelyn de Morgan and Marianne Stokes, both of whom did a version of the Death and the Maiden, in which the maiden actually looks really pleased to see Death, and Death seems to be quite a comforting figure instead. And I did talk about both of those paintings in the episodes about both of those artists. But I do think it's quite fascinating how these different types of burial markers do appear so regularly. Part of it will of course be because that was what was on offer by monumental sculptures at the time, and the Victorians obviously like to keep up with trends and so on in exactly the same way that people do now. So I think you can sort of gauge what the tastes were at the time by the kind of burial marker that somebody chose. So for example, we have quite a few obelisks, but we've got a lot of Celtic crosses in Jesmond Old Cemetery. But then if you go across the road to All Saints, you have things like the Angel of Grief, but then a lot of the other monuments and so on are just ordinary tombstones, or they're the large table graves where they've kind of got the border around the edge and they don't really have a proper marker as such. So it's interesting to see how these things differ, and that's just in 2 cemeteries across the road from each other in Newcastle. Clearly it's going to be very different as you then go around basically any part of this archipelago of islands. And that obviously applies to lich gates as well, where they do still exist. They have a whole range of different designs and so on, which is what makes them really quite interesting, the fact that you don't really get 2 that are identical. They do vary. And churchyards are obviously filled with lots more types of monument, many more that I can actually feature here. Some of them bear long inscriptions about the deceased themselves. Others include carvings related to what the deceased did in life. Some of them are deeply sad or moving, and then others actually give a really lovely insight into someone's quite lively personality, and I always quite like them. And you actually can read a churchyard as a book of life despite its associations with death. And I think churchyards provide a record of who these people were, sometimes how they died, and just a reminder that they actually mattered to someone. And lich gates likewise remind us that churchyards once held great significance within the community too. So they divided the worlds of the living and the dead, and they played a role in the burial service, which is like our last chance to say goodbye to somebody before they go, essentially. And even now, where lich gates act as memorials, they are still reminding us to think of the dead, whether we knew them or not. And I actually dedicate this post to all of those people who were buried who, for whatever reason, had no stone to commemorate their name. You are still remembered. But I would love it if you wanted to let me know if there are any unusual burial markers, grave inscriptions, or even lich gates near you. If you do have pictures of lich gates and so on, please feel free to send them over. Instagram's probably a good place to do that. But otherwise, feel free to let me know, because you know how mad I am on things to do with cemeteries and churchyards and stuff. So it's always quite interesting to see what's near people. And I'll be really interested to see what some of these look like outside of the UK as well, because I know that obviously among my American listeners, you sometimes have some absolutely fabulous monuments. And there is a girl on Instagram who goes around cemeteries where there are graves where someone's actually had like a family recipe inscribed on the grave headstone, which I think is a brilliant idea. But she then makes the recipe and enjoys the fruits of it next to the grave, which I think is such a lovely way of providing a reminder for that person and continuing to engage with someone even when they've gone. So it is really interesting to see, as I say, how these things do vary and so on in various different parts of the world, which is cool. Next week, we're going to have a look at notorious churches. And I've got one particular one in mind. Like I said last week, I've wanted to talk about this one for a while, but I wasn't really sure how or indeed why. So it's going to be quite good to have a look at that one. And there's also going to be some focus later on like weird things to see in churches, or just church novelties and curiosities and things like that. Like, for example, the sanctuary knocker at Durham Cathedral is really interesting. So there will be various things like that, or just things to look out for around churches and stuff as well. And somebody asked for church art, which I might have to spend a bit of time actually having a look into. But there we go. There's loads to get into this month with the folklore of churches. Obviously, I've already done things like church superstitions and haunted churches before, so we're going off down a very different path this month, which is why I enjoy doing the podcast, because I get to fall down all of these really lovely research rabbit holes. And you lot seem to quite enjoy the fact that I do that and share what I find. So, as always, thank you for letting me do that. Also, thank you very much for everybody who continues to buy coffees, become a patron on Patreon, or indeed on Coffee, where you can also get the bonus episodes as well for a recurring membership if that's easier. And all of that kind of support helps to make the podcast happen. People who leave reviews, you're also absolute stars, because that helps with algorithmic kind of stuff and helps kind of put things in front of people who will also like it. Word of mouth, people who pass on word of mouth, you have no idea how valuable that is, because again, you're able to put the podcast in front of people who will like it and enjoy it and get something out of it in a way that just completely circumvents social media. And I think that even though you might use social media to tell someone, it's not having to rely on platforms that none of us own to pass on information. So I think that can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, if you enjoyed this, obviously feel free to subscribe on your podcast player of choice, or indeed on YouTube if that's easier. Or you can sign up for my emails, and I'll email you every week when a blog post comes out, and that's always got the podcast player in it as well. And the link for all of that stuff, apart from the podcast player, because I've got no control over that, the other links are all in the show notes, as always. But I've waffled on long enough now, so thank you very much for your time, as always. Next week we'll have a look at notorious churches, which will be quite a lot of fun. Gory, but fun. And I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.